In this debrief, we're going to be looking at a question that was tested in the March-June 2021 exam, and it's on currency hedging. We're going to be focusing on part A, which is the more tricky technically of the two requirements. So in this question, we're being asked to give advice and recommend a hedging strategy. It's very important that you don't just produce a set of numbers in currency hedging questions. And the examiner is constantly complaining that people are not giving advice and recommendations. And in doing so, you're missing out on marks. Now, we don't know exactly how many marks are available for discussion, but it's generally at least 4 or 5 marks. So very important that you secure those marks. And one way of doing that is to make sure that you use the word processing function as well as the spreadsheet. So you're going to put your comments in there, but the calculations clearly are going to go in the spreadsheet, and we'll have a look at those in a minute. We'll also cover professional skills towards the end of the debrief, but these are meant to be a natural consequence of a good answer. So a quick look at the scenario. We've got a couple of transactions happening at the end of August, and it's now the beginning of May. So the end of August is May, June, July, August, 4 months' time. And we can start off by netting the receipt and the payment, and that's going to give us $22.9 million that we're expecting to receive on the 31st of August, and we are based in Malaysia, so these are a foreign currency. And then we've got some exchange rates, and it's really important that in the exam, when you're reading the scenario, that you spend about 20% of your time reading the scenario, because if you don't really focus on what's going on, you'll miss something basic, and there'll be a big penalty for that in currency hedging questions. So the currencies here are quoted to the MR, which is our Malaysian currency, to 1 unit. So it's absolutely crucial that we get that right. About 24 cents is worth 1 unit of the Malaysian ringgit. So when we're talking about dollar amounts, when we convert into the Malaysian ringgit, that will be a bigger number. We'll need to bear that in mind. And then we've got a spread, and we've got to get the spread right. So on the right hand side of the spread, this higher rate is the rate for buying dollars. And that's normally the rate we're going to be using because we're dealing with dollar receipts. Okay, and then we've got spot, forward, futures, and options. We're told that the futures and options have contract sizes in the Malaysian ringgit, and we're told to assume that any unhedged or overhedged amounts are managed by using the forward market, and that options are exercised. Exhibit 2 relates to part B of the question, and we'll look at that in a minute. Staying with the numbers, let's start off with the forward calculations. We're going to show these in a spreadsheet, and we'll gradually build this up, but focusing first of all on the forward amount, I would show the net amount, so that's 37,400,000 less the payment of 14,500,000. So that's the 22.9 million. You'll get a mark for that. And then I'm going to take that amount. I'm going to have a nice neat column for the Malaysian ringgit, for the exchange rate, and for the dollar. And then my revenue, if I use forward contracts, will be the 22.9 million divided by the exchange rate using the right-hand side of the spread. So that's 0.2374. And just sense checking it, I've got fewer dollars than Malaysian ringgits, and that's correct. That's the way it should be. And I'll get a mark or so for the forward just for the calculation. And then I can look at the futures and show some workings, which I've got on the right hand side. The September future is quoted in the question at 0.2378, and the spot rate using the right hand side of the spread is 0.2358. Future minus spot gives me basis. And that basis arises because there are 5 months of timing difference between now, the 1st of May, and the end of September. By the time we get to the end of August, which is when the transaction happens, there's only 1 month left, and so only 1/5 of that basis should remain. And that allows me to work out the lock-in rate or the effective rate for a future as the opening future minus the closing basis. And that's my effective futures rate, my lock-in rate. And that's fundamental to my calculations. First of all, it allows me to calculate the number of contracts. With this 22.9 million converted at the effective rate into Malaysian ringgits, with the contract size being 500,000 Malaysian ringgits, then that should be 192.92 contracts, which I'm going to round to 193. Now, you might prefer to show that sort of calculation in your word processing package where you can explain what you're doing. That's a matter of preference. So I've got 193 contracts, and these are contracts to buy the Malaysian ringgit. So the futures transaction involves 193 contracts of 500,000 each. The lock-in rate I've calculated. And so in dollars, that is multiplying by the exchange rate, 22,909,100. So if I'm going to exercise my futures contract transaction, I'm going to have to take $22,909,100 to the exchange. But my problem is I don't have that amount. I've got 22.9 million. And so there is a shortage of 9,100. So I'm going to have to go out and buy that amount of money. Now I'm told in the question to use the forward rate to hedge this, and the forward rate is 0.2374, but that's if it's revenue, and this is a shortage, it's a cost, so it's 0.2370, that's the rate given in the question, and that's the forward rate. So converting the 9,100 into Malaysian currency, that's 9,100 divided by 0.237, and that's 38,397. And so my outcome is going to be the futures transaction, and then recognizing that there's a shortage, and that gives me 96,461,603. And there were about 5 marks for those calculations. And then finally the options. Okay, so with the options I've got to choose between calls and puts. Because I'm going to be buying the Malaysian ringgit, that's going to be a call. And I'm going to be doing this after June. I'm going to be doing it at the end of August. And so I need a September call. And so the exercise price, well, there's only one given. And the premium is quoted in US cents per Malaysian ringgit. So taking that information, I'm told to assume the option's exercised, and it's going to be a September call option. The exchange rate's given in the question, the premium's given in the question. The premium was given in cents, so I've divided it by 100 to put it into dollars. So the number of contracts I'm going to need will be the underlying transaction, 22.9 million, converted into Malaysian ringgit at the call option rate, and then divided by 500,000, and that gives me 193.4, which I'm going to round to 193. So again, setting up a column for the two different currencies. To work out the premium in Malaysian ringgit, I've got to take 193 contracts of 500,000 each, and I've got to multiply by 0.0014, which is in cell E24. And that's going to give me the amount in dollars for the premium. And that's going to be paid. And because it's paid, I take the spot rate because I pay it today, but I take the left-hand side of the spot because it's a payment. So that's 0.2355. And then dividing through, I get a premium of just over 570,000 Malaysian ringgits. Okay, and that's a cost. Now I'm told to assume that the option's exercised at the rates given in the question. So when I exercise the option, it's going to be 193 contracts of 500,000 each, In dollars, that is 96.5 million Malaysian ringgits multiplied by 0.2368. So that's slightly different from the 22.9 million, which we've got as our actual transaction. And there's a difference of 48,800. And this time it's a surplus. And it's going to happen at the end of August, so I can use the forward rate here. And the forward rate for a receipt is 0.2374. And so the surplus will be 48,800 divided by 0.2374. And then the net amount will be the premium, the exercise of the option, and the surplus. And that gives me 96,131,887 in Malaysian ringgit. And unsurprisingly, that's not an attractive option compared to the future or the forward, which look like they're going to give a better outcome. So much for the numbers. Then I've got to use them to come up with an answer, a discussion, and a recommendation. So I would write this up in my word processing package, but the points will flow from the calculations that I've got, and I'll get credit for them even if my calculations are wrong. And that's another reason why getting on to those discussion points is so important. So first of all, the forward. The forward is the best outcome, so I'm going to recommend it. I'm going to recommend it because I don't have to put a deposit down. It's for exactly the amount of money that I'm looking for. However, if there's any delay in either transaction, it may not be valid. If we don't have that currency there, there's no flexibility with the time period. The future gives you a slightly worse outcome, but more flexibility because it's a September future, so it could be used up to the end of September. But it carries the risk that the futures rate won't move simply in the way that we forecast, and that is basis risk. And also it's complicated because we've got to put a deposit down to start with, and we've got a separate shortage that we have to hedge. The option's the worst outcome, but that's only if you assume it's exercised. And it won't be exercised if the exchange rate moves in your favor. So in this case, as we've got a net receipt, if the Malaysian ringgit gets cheaper, then our outcome would be better. With forwards and futures, however, you're tied into the agreement, but with options, you've got the discretion to abandon the option and just use the actual transaction. So those are the discussion points. None of them are difficult, and you make a reasonable recommendation. Here, I would probably go for the forward on the basis that it's the simplest argument to make. It's the best outcome. And then in part B, we have to discuss how the Treasury function might manage economic risk. So economic risk is long-term risk, and it's a long-term risk, a long-term movement in the exchange rate that affects the MPV of Gogarth. So Gogarth has got this big market in America, we're told, and so here it might be that the American dollar over the long term devalues, and so those dollars are worth much less in Malaysian ringgit in future years and decades. And it's that long-term risk that you have to discuss here. And as long as you try to do that, so as long as you understand what economic risk is, you'll get good reward for any points that you make. And as you make a good technical answer, you'll also pick up professional marks because you'll be able to talk about the risk of the US dollar devaluing. That's what matters here. And that sort of awareness of what's going on in the scenario will help you to pick up commercial acumen marks, making good logical points using the scenario. Analysis and evaluation, well, this is about using the numbers and presenting the numbers in a way that the marker can follow. So a professional answer will choose the right sort of numbers, will then use those numbers in a logical evaluation. So these should be things that you're doing anyway in a good technical answer. And just as a final point in this debrief, a good answer to this question doesn't mean that you get every number right. It means that you get the basics right, that you set up the hedges in a broadly correct way, and that you get your discussion points in part B. and you present your answer in a way that the marker can follow. So have a look at the way the solution splits up the narrative in part A into a word processing and a spreadsheet section. And that's a really good way of enhancing clarity in your answer in the exam. And that completes this debrief.